The Tuesday, September 12th, Finance and Planning Committee meeting will now come to order. The record will reflect that we are convened as of 5:31 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time. And I would respectfully ask everyone who is attending this meeting to please mute yourself unless you are recognized to speak. That will provide for a more accurate and comprehensive record. I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. Please note that the committee meetings of the RTD Board of Directors, as contrasted with the full board meetings, will continue for a while to be held remotely via Zoom, and they will be audio and video recorded. These meeting recordings, along with the unofficial minutes of the proceedings, will be posted as soon as is reasonably practicable on the board's website. So please visit rtd-denver.com and you will be able to access those, and a live stream of this meeting is also available via RTD's YouTube page. Directors and members of the staff, for the sake of the record, I would ask you please, if you would like to be acknowledged during the course of these proceedings this evening, we respectfully ask you to raise your virtual hand and wait for me to call upon you before proceeding to speak. And directors and staff who are participating in this meeting via telephone can also raise their virtual hands to indicate that they would like to speak simply by pressing *9 on your phone. That's *9. And then to toggle your mute settings on the phone on and off, you simply have to press *6. So I would now like to call the roll for the committee members this evening. And first I call the roll and ask Director Peggy Catlin.
Here.
All right, and Director Bobby Deschel is not available to join us this evening and has an excused absence. Next, Chair Lynn Geisinger.
I'm here.
Thank you. And then next, Director Michael Guzman.
I am here.
And then next, Director Ian Harwick.
Here.
Thank you. And Vice Chair Eric Davidson.
Here.
And I am Doug Tisdale, the chair of the Finance and Planning Committee, and I am present. So we have all but one of our committee members with us. For the sake of the record, I would also like to note that we have present this evening Directors Bob Broom, Troy Whitmore, and Marjorie Sloan. Are there any other directors who are present that I have not acknowledged? All right, then we are ready to, I'm sorry, Director Ruscia, I just saw your hand pop up. I did not see your name before, but I think that's because you're on the second screen of my computer here. So I thank you for that, Director Ruscia, you are acknowledged. We now proceed to the public comment portion of our meeting, and we open the public comment to anyone who would like to address the committee regarding any topic that we have listed in the published meeting agenda, either for this meeting or for the immediately preceding month. So if you had something that you wanted to say, and for these purposes, because we did not meet in August, that refers to July of this year. So if you wish to speak, and you haven't already done this, then please either raise your virtual hand or press *9 on your phone. And during this time, when we have public comment, The committee will not offer any direct comments or responses relative to whatever you may bring up. However, if you would like to be contacted regarding whatever your public comment may have raised, please do email the RTD board office at rtd.boardoffice. That's rtd.boardoffice@rtd-denver.com. So now let me ask staff if there are any hands that you see that have been raised. I do not notice any on my screen, but I ask, do we have anyone indicating they would like to speak?
Me, Chair Tisdale, we have not received any indication that there will be any public comment provided in person or via virtual means this evening, and we likewise did not receive any public comments submitted ahead of time via email or other correspondence method.
All right, thank you. That very conveniently goes through the other questions I was going to raise. So we have no persons on this Zoom conference indicating a desire to make public comment. We have no persons on the telephone indicating so, and we have received no email comments. So with that in mind, and I will pause for a moment in case anyone at the last minute has a thought that they would like to be acknowledged. Having paused, I will now close the public comment section of our meeting, and we proceed to the next portion of our agenda, which is an opportunity for us to receive information from external entities who would like to address our committee. I am informed by staff that we have no such requests or other information from external entities this month. Mr. Board Manager, can you please confirm that for me?
That is correct, Chair Tisdale. There is no external entities wishing to provide an update at this time.
All right, thank you very much. Then we proceed to recommended actions, and there is one recommended action on the agenda this evening that was circulated to you, and that action is for the 2024-2029 midterm financial plan, also referred to as the MTFP for midterm financial plan. And the action is for the board of directors to adopt the 2024-2029 midterm financial plan. Do we have a motion?
So moved, Director Davidson.
Thank you very much, Director Davidson. And a second?
Second.
I heard Director Guzman first, and I thank you all for not speaking at once. It was nice. There was a nice pause there, so it made sure that there was no over speaking. That's always very considerate. So I have a motion by Davidson and a second by Guzman on the MTFP. And at this point in time, then, it is my privilege to ask Mr. Doug McLeod, our Chief Financial Officer, and Mr. Todd Nickel, the Senior Manager of Budget, to present this item. Mr. McLeod, you may proceed, sir.
Thank you. I think I was on mute. Thank you, Chair Tisdale, and good evening. As Chair Tisdale mentioned, this is an action item to approve the midterm financial plan, the MTFP. You'll recall on July 11th, Todd Nickel did present an update as a discussion item to the board, giving some parameters surrounding the midterm financial plan. This action item is to ask for committee and board approval of this plan going forward. So without further ado, I have a short presentation of approximately 10 slides to go through. So let me share my screen. Okay. So just some background on the MTFP itself. So this is for the 6-year period 2024 through 2029. It is a 6-year forecast. It's a strategic financial planning document, meaning that it's really just simply for planning. It is not necessarily for any appropriation or spending approval. It's really to help the agency determine what funding will be used and in what manner over the next several years, the next 6 years, based on current available information in terms of revenues and expenditures. One of the critical items that we want to do with this this financial plan, is to line it with our strategic plan. So we've made sure that both the revenues and the expenditures address those issues as they're known at the current time. It also establishes a baseline for the budget, the 2024 budget in particular. So in October, the finance department will come to this committee requesting that or presenting a discussion item for the 2024 budget. Then in November of 2023, we will come back to the committee and ask for approval of the 2024 budget. This MTFP is a planning document that kind of sets that stage. It helps us look at the next 6-year period in order to make sure that we are financially secure in terms of our revenues equal our expenditures, and also to ensure that we have a baseline so that when we do budget, we know what that looks like going forward. Again, this is not an appropriation, it's simply a planning document. So a few things before I get into the actual cash flows. Some of the assumptions that were included in developing these numbers. Fair revenue is lower than the previous forecasts that were presented in the midterm financial plan that was presented at this time last year. The reason for that is implementation of the FAIR study and what the projections are for the impacts from those initiatives beginning in 2024. Sales and use taxes are slightly lower than previous versions. Since the midterm financial plan that was presented last year, we've received 2 new forecasts, sales and use tax forecasts from the University of Colorado Lied School of Business. The most recent forecast was received in August of this year. The March forecast received previously to that showed a significant increase over the prior year MTFP. However, the August forecast, the most recent forecast, actually slightly lowered some of those projections, particularly in the year of 2024. That's mainly due to the fact that sales and use taxes for the months of April through June, those 3 months have been relatively flat and actually lower than the previous year, same months. So to put that into context, the average growth of the sales and use taxes projected over 30 years is 3.3% in the most recent forecast. And the current forecast is 4.4% for the next 6 years. So some significant growth continued to be projected, even though there's a slightly lower forecast in this MTFP. An additional factor that was used in putting together this midterm financial plan is sustainable service levels. So those sustainable service levels, when we develop the actual operating expenses, we use the system optimization plan through service planning. So it's the current plan that's been developed for the next 3 cycles, essentially, and then we carry that forward, assuming certain inflationary factors, certain contractual factors to cover the full 6 years. So we do take into account those sustainable service levels when we put together the expenditures. Another important point is asset maintenance is fully funded. That is our asset management plan and our state of good repair initiative to take care of the assets that we do have. We do have the available funding in this forecast to make sure that that occurs. And then finally, fund balances are maintained. In October, we will bring to this committee the fiscal policy. Within that fiscal policy, we have certain parameters that we try to meet for fiscal sustainability purposes here at RTD. Number 1 being a 3-month operating reserve, as well as certain debt coverage ratios. So our fund balances are being maintained. So we're maintaining our financial position throughout the 6-year period with these forecasted revenues and expenditures. And finally, a few more assumptions that go into this midterm financial plan. When I mentioned the strategic plan implementation, there's certain items that we're really focused on going forward, in particular, people power, a welcoming transit environment, and back to basics regarding state of good repair. Each of those items has been taken into consideration based on current information to help develop the expenditures that we're putting forth in these cash flows. Another important item that's been a hot topic lately is our TABOR limits, the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. There will be a discussion item later this evening, speaking further on the initiatives surrounding that statute. Essentially, what we've done is made some limits that I'll show to this committee when we go through the cash flows to be conservative in our approach about forecasting revenues in light of the revenue growth limitations that apply through Tabor. And then finally, economic volatility. So what you'll see too is we have some swings in some of our expenses and some of our revenues that I will point out, but that's a big concern for us in terms of fiscal sustainability and developing a sound fiscal policy, as well as starting from a sound basis in terms of our financial position. Just to highlight a couple items on on a trended basis regarding our total revenues and total expenditures on the next slide. This is the current year MTFP in the blue bars versus last year's MTFP. So what we've put in this current MTFP, we've actually seen an increase in forecasted revenues. The main driver of those in the current MTFP is increased sales taxes year over year. So we saw really good results in 2022 over and above what was forecasted for that year. That came into the current year forecast going forward. So we're seeing good results there. We also had some good news a year and a half ago with the bipartisan infrastructure law that increased some of our ongoing preventive maintenance grants from the federal government by $30 million. So those two are primary revenue funding sources, sales and use taxes, as well as grants, have shown some significant increases in terms of their projections going forward. On the expenditure side, again, blue bars are the current MTFP that we're presenting this month, September 2023, versus last year's MTFP presented in September 22. We also have increased expenditures. The largest driver on that is we've refined some of our inflationary factors. So throughout this 6-year period, what we've assumed, in addition to some contractual increases, is also inflationary increases based on the higher inflation rates that we've been seeing most recently in the last year and a half. So what these numbers reflect in the blue bars is actually a 5.1% year-over-year increase due to inflationary pressures primarily. So now we'll have 3 slides to go through showing cash flows. The first one will be the base system, followed by fast tracks, then followed by the full midterm financial plan for the entire agency. We've broken out the base system and fast tracks to show the impact between the two entities. So just as a reminder, the base system is the name that we use for the portion of the operations that were established in 1969, and it's tied to the 0.6% sales tax. So in total, RTD collects a 1% sales tax. 60% of that belongs to the base system. Those base system revenues can be spent on the fast track system, but not vice versa. The fast track system was implemented with voter approval in 2004. And we keep those two entities, the base system and fast track, separate for bookkeeping purposes because of the revenue sharing issue that we must track separately. So what I'll show you is how the base system cash flows look versus the fast tracks system cash flows, followed by the consolidated cash flows. So regarding the base system, which is primarily bus and light rail service, what you'll notice, what's noteworthy on this slide itself, is that beginning in 2024, the second line item, sales and use taxes, what we've done in 2025, because the 6/10 is subject to Tabor revenue growth limitations, you'll recall that once the bonds are paid off on the base system side in 2024, that final bond matures in 2024. Subsequent to that, the following year, RTD for the base system, the 6/10 will be subject to Tabor growth limitations, which are a combination of the consumer price index or inflation plus property tax growth. So what we've assumed in the base system, as opposed to the 4.4% projected growth throughout the MTFP period provided by CU leads, we've cut that back to 1.4% year over year. So we're being conservative, we feel, on that end for fiscal sustainability purposes. That 1.4% came from a study that was done after the last Great Recession in 2008, 2009. What was the year over year property tax growth within the district? It was 1.4%. So that's our approach as far as our largest single revenue source goes for the base system. I think the final item I'd like to point out on this slide is just the bottom line, the net cash flow. I think what's instructive here is you can see it's positive. So on the base system side, it really becomes positive in 2024. Again, that's when the last of the base system bonds are paid off. The base system still does have some debt in the form of lease purchase agreements or certificates of participation. Those are not subject to Tabor rules, while bonds are. So in 2024, what happens is we pay off all the base system debt, and you can see growth year over year of net cash flow increases. So a total for the 6-year period plus the amended budget is $1 billion positive on the bottom line for the base system. Moving on to fast tracks, a little bit different picture on the 4/10 sales tax. And again, fast tracks cannot use funding to pay the base, but base can use its funding to fund fast tracks operations. So I think what's important on this slide is you'll notice, and I'll just go right to the bottom line here, the net cash flow for the fast track system is negative. The largest driver of the negative cash flow on the fast track system is the way that the debt was structured. So when fast tracks was being built, most of the infrastructure was financed through issuance of bonds from fast tracks. Those bonds are supported by sales and use taxes. The plan was, because base system still had large debt, that the large debt obligation on its system was to pay off the base system debt first and delay payments on principal on the fast track system until a later date. So we still got the cash in up front. We're able to complete fast tracks projects, but the anticipation was to delay some of those principal payments, basically just paying interest on the fast tracks debt during that interim period until the base system had more cash flow capacity, which was shown on the prior slide, in order to allow the base to be able to help pay for some of the fast tracks debt. So even though the negative cash flow is showing here on the fast track side, it's primarily driven by the debt load and paying down the debt service. The final bond maturity on the fast track system will occur in 2050, 2050. So over the intervening period, the debt service increases, as you can see there on the fourth line from the bottom. It increases over a period of time as we pay down more and more principal until it's ultimately paid off in 2050. The base system will help subsidize that to a certain extent. Now, I think it's worth pointing out that the fast track system is not just new rail. So when fast tracks was implemented, it consisted primarily of rail lines, commuter rail, and some additional light rail lines and extensions. However, the fast track system also has some bus service. So for instance, the bus rapid transit, the Flatiron Flyer that goes up to US 36, that is actually a fast tracks enhancement. So that's funded by both the base system and fast tracks. Additionally, fast tracks does pay the base system for bus feeder service and certain paratransit services. So some of our rubber tire service increased when the new rail lines for fast tracks were put in place. So the 2004 voter authorization in the financial plan, it included a provision for the basis for the fast track system to pay the base for additional bus service that would be generated to provide feeder service to these new rail lines. And because of the expansion of the system, paratransit services expanded as well. Those services those rubber tire services are primarily on the base system side, with the exception of certain bus enhancements that were done on fast tracks that are paid directly. So the fast track system actually pays the base system approximately $20 million per year. And to make a long story a little bit longer, I just wanted to mention that when we speak of the FISA, one of the primary funding mechanisms of the fast tracks internal savings account fund has been the difference between the original plan of what the fast tracks was to pay the base system for rubber tire service and what the current actual funding is that happens. So essentially, the 2004 plan had the fast track system over its entire existence, assuming that a 1% increase in bus feeder service on revenue service would increase by 1% every year. And fast tracks was to pay the base system for that. About 2013, the board at the time said, our rubber tire service isn't growing at 1% revenue hours per year. So let's reduce that amount to the consumer price index year over year to reflect the increase in costs for providing the service. So the difference between the original calculation and that CPI or inflation factor, which is lower, actually goes into the FISA. So I just wanted to point that out just to set some bearings in terms of how the funding between these two entities works. So I'll go ahead and move on to the total. So this is both Fast Tracks and Base put together. It's the entirety of RTV. So you can see the entire picture on a cash flow basis where we have the revenues at the top. Those are our main revenues, and you can see what's happening with fare revenues. While we do have some growth contemplated in there as the system grows, there's certain assumptions in terms of small ridership growth, as well as some assumptions about the impact of the fare study and what will happen in the future. But nonetheless, our fares are relatively small in context to sales and use taxes, as well as grant revenue and other income. So sales and use taxes is our primary component. In 2023, they're projected in that first column to be about 75% of the total revenues, followed by grant revenue, and then some other miscellaneous income, primarily investment income and some miscellaneous leases and advertising revenue. So those are our primary sources when you look at the agency as a whole. And you can see we're growing from about expected $1.2 billion. And by the way, these are in thousands, so we leave the last three digits off. 2023 is $1.2 billion, growing to $1.4 billion at the end of the MTFP period in 2029. Beyond that, we have operating expenses, debt service, and capital expenditures / state of good repair costs. So our operating expenditures less depreciation, so we're basically just showing cash going out the door for operations, are approximately $900 million in 2023 projected, growing to $1.1 billion over that 6-year period. These costs, again, are based on the system optimization plan, as well as certain expense projects. So that's why the fluctuation occurs between years that you'll see, in addition to contractual increases such as the collective bargaining agreement, assumed wage increases, wages and compensation, which is wages and benefits, are our largest single expenditure. So we've contemplated growth in those costs of approximately, all of our operating costs of approximately 5.1% year over year. Debt service, when we looked at the previous slide, you could see it kind of grew on the Fast Track side and decreased on the base system side. But when you add them together, it's relatively flat over the period. But that's a pretty hefty number. Approximately $250 million every year goes out to service RTD's debt. And then our capital expenditure state of good repair. I think it's important to note here that it fluctuates year to year, and that's based on our current thinking in terms of maintaining our assets and replacing them and repairing them based on the information that we have. So our net cash flow down there on the bottom line, it's relatively close to a break even almost every year. We have some swings up and down. By the end of the 2023 through 2029 period, you can see it's virtually balanced. $9.1 billion coming in, just under $9.1 billion going out. So a net projected cash flow increase of $17 million. So what I would point out too, so the second to the bottom line, contributions to or use of reserves. The reason that number is going up and down is because of our fiscal policy, what we need to do with any additional cash flow is continue to grow our 3-month operating reserve. And again, this is a policy set by the board where we want to have reserves set aside for operating expenditures in the event we see a downturn in sales and use tax or some other type of black swan event that we need to deal with. We'll have those reserves in place to maintain operations for a period of time to ensure that we don't have to make cuts immediately, at least on the operating side. So what we're doing is we're building up those operating reserves as our operating expenses increase to maintain that 3 months of reserves over time. So we're maintaining those reserves. And then we're also putting cash away we also have a capital replacement fund. It's a reserve as well. In good years where we have extra cash, we put money into that reserve. Then when we spend it down, it's for state of good repair items. For example, periodically we'll order a lot of buses altogether. That's a large expenditure. We'll take that reserve down to finance those or to pay for those payments instead of financing by borrowing to make those purchases. So you can see the growth in reserves there on the bottom line. And I think you'll notice that in 2029, it actually drops, but we actually still meet all of our fiscal policies because in the intervening years, we're actually above those fiscal policy requirements. So here's just an idea of what pictorially what those fund balances look like over time, and it's broken into the three main sections. Unrestricted operating reserve is the 3-month reserve shown in yellow. Capital replacement fund that we use for state of good repair is shown in the gray portion of the bar. And then our unrestricted fund balance or deficit is shown in the blue bar. That unrestricted fund balance is essentially what's left over once we've met all of our fiscal policies. So what you can see, I think that the takeaway on this slide really is to show that our unrestricted balance, we're actually drawing that down to pay mainly for capital repairs and state of good repair on our asset management plan over time. That's excess funding. But by the time we get to the end of the 2029 period, it's just important to note this, that while we have a lot of cash now, we're going to, what the plan is that we will continue to grow our reserves, but we'll use up that excess cash for our state of good repair needs. So there's not a lot, there's been some talk about, well, RTD has a lot of money. That's true, but it all has been designated for certain purposes over time. So with that, Mr. Chair, I would like to stop here, and Todd and I can field any questions that the committee may have.
I thank you very much for your presentation, Mr. McLeod. And is there anything that Todd would like to say first before I open up for questions? Todd, I don't see you and I don't hear you. There we are. Okay. Is there anything you would like to add just before I open up for questions?
No, I think Doug covered it real well and hit the main points.
Great. Thank you. I appreciate that. So at this time, directors, in the first instance, I will ask the committee members of the Finance and Planning Committee if they have any questions that they would like to address to Mr. McLeod or to Mr. Nickel relative to this item. After that, I will go to other board members who are present on this meeting and ask them if they would like to speak. But in the first instance, are there committee members who would like to be recognized for purposes of questions or comments on the midterm financial plan? I see no hands raised or any. Oh, wait, now I do. All right, took me a second for my screen to catch up. Director Catlin, you are recognized first, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know, it's clear that the base system is because of the no longer having debt service after 2024 will be, I guess, in good financial straits, but the fast track system will not. And so when you look at the overall picture of the NTFP total, it looks like there will be subsidy from the base system to the fast tracks plan. My concern is that what would be the consequences to operations of the base system as a result of that? Using those funds to shore up the fast tracks plan, you know, and maybe that's a question for Ms. Johnson as opposed to our financial people. But I just want to make sure that we are not cannibalizing the base system for fast tracks, because I think we really are, in my opinion, I think we need to make sure that we have a solid foundation for the base system and bus service. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Director. And let me recognize then General Manager CEO Johnson, if she would like to weigh in first on that, and then any follow-up to Mr. McLeod. But General Manager, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Director Catlin, for the question. I believe in reference to what we are doing collectively, we're being intentional as we use this forecasting document, recognizing that our core business function is delivery of transit service. Mr. McLeod referenced in his introductory remarks that we have a laser focus on 3 key initiatives that have spawned from our 4 strategic priorities being community value, customer excellence, employee ownership, and financial success. Those 3 initiatives are back to basics, recognizing our state of good repair as we need to invest in our system holistically to sustain the operability of our transit network. And also the aspect of people power relative to where we are with our base system. And then, of course, the welcoming transit environment. And that's just not merely for our customers, but for our employees. And what that means holistically is in investing in the facilities, recognizing that they're very outdated and antiquated relative to new technologies that are emerging. We want to ensure that that is where the focal point is. So traditionally, we have bifurcated the fast track system from the base system, but to the average person utilizing their system, they're one and the same. And as we bring those full circle, it's using our comprehensive operational analysis that has been coined here as the system optimization plan to determine levels of efficiency. And we are currently working as a leadership team, as well as members of our management team, and of course, our budget office, having a laser-like focus on what are we trying to achieve. And our budgeting process is going to be more focused on our revenue service hours because that's our core business. And so with that, I provide that context to say relative to discussions in which we've had, those parameters that I've outlined, those initiatives are intended as relates to what our financial health is. They're aligned with what we can deliver. So that's a very contextualized explanation to say that we are going to ensure that we can deliver on our base system that is the foundation of our transit network and the backbone of it. And I'll yield the floor to Mr. McLeod to expound on the financial piece of that and how we've gone full circle.
You know, if I might,
Yes, Director
Johnson.
Kaplan.
thank you very much for that. That's very reassuring. And I, forgive me, Doug did mention that we are basing it on our strategic priorities. And so your explanation helps a lot, and I appreciate that. I just have been concerned about not delivering the service in the base system that our customers expect. But your explanation was very satisfactory. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And so I take it, Director Catlin, you don't need to hear further from Mr. McLeod or Mr. Nickel. All right, thank you.
I do not.
All right, I read your lips. It's okay. I appreciate that. Are there any other committee members? Director Guzman, I saw you had your hand up previously. If you would like, this is your opportunity for comments or questions.
Thank you for recognizing me. I had a similar question to Director Catlin. Maybe just a bit of clarification on the debt service for the fast tracks being paid off. I don't understand how that number gets so large so quick, but also the history lesson was important. So thank you for that. If I understood it correctly, we've only basically paid interest on fast tracks. And now we've got to pay down the principal balance for the debt service for that. Is that the correct understanding, and why those numbers are so large?
And let me turn to Mr. McLeod on that one. But in summary, I would say yes, debt service is all it's been, is debt service, not debt retirement. But let me turn to Mr. McLeod for expansion on that.
Thank you, Chair Tisdale, and thank you for the question, Director Guzman. Yes, so those two cash flows may be a little bit misleading because I think General Manager Johnson really put it into context when she was talking about the entire system. So the way the finances were actually structured, this was deliberate and intentional, that the base system would focus on paying off its debt, and the fast track system would only pay interest on that debt until a later period in time when the base system had paid off its debt, had free cash flow to assist the base system in paying off its debt over the remaining 30 years or so. The reason being primarily is because the base system can fund fast tracks, but not vice versa. So it was done intentionally because if the fast track system had been paying down additional debt all that time, and the base system the base system didn't have the extra cash flow, it wouldn't have allowed for the fast track system to have enough cash flow to sustain its operations during that period of time while the base system was paying off its debt. So I don't know if I'm explaining that well, but essentially it was structured because of the rule that the base system can fund fast tracks, but not vice versa. And it was a conservative approach so that we didn't spend down fast tracks too fast that it ran out of money to support itself before the base system had the ability to help fund that. So it was intentional. It was part of the plan to build as much as we can, as fast as we can. I know that's an old phrase, but in order to get those fast tracks, additional systems, additional elements completed, that large debt had to be issued at that time, knowing the base system was going to have to help fund it at a later point in time. So hopefully that helps.
Thank you.
Thank you, Director Guzman. And yes, I will point out again, just for the record, for some who may not know this, but our ability to open up, what was it, 5 new lines over the course of a 3-year period was because of some of that financial management that RTD did, much of it under Heather Kopp when she was our Chief Financial Officer. So we were able to do a lot and provide a greatly expanded network by virtue of that. Director Harwick, committee member, you are recognized, sir. You appear to be speaking, but you also still appear for some reason to be on mute. Can you confirm that?
We can't hear you and you're not muted.
There we go. Is that it? Yeah, sorry. Switching between day job and night job. Technology was not my friend today. So I'm just going to preface this. I'm not a finance guy. So I just looking at this, and Mr. McLeod, when I say this, I recognize you stop at 2029. But as I'm looking at this and I'm looking at our net cash flow, looks great next year, and then it goes down and then down and then down, and it just continually gets worse. And so if even if it just stayed at us losing $61 million a year, I feel like it within 10 years, and granted, none of us will be here in theory, in 2039, at least not on RTD. It looks like our reserves will be gone. Am I reading that right? And I recognize I'm asking something about 16 years in the future, but I just want to make sure I'm understanding correctly.
It's a
legitimate question, Mr. McLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, you're right. And if we continue on that trend, because essentially our expenditures are growing faster than our revenue. So at some point, yeah, those losses become bigger and you have to dig into reserves to pay for those things. But I think what's kind of buried in those numbers and what we've assumed through the midterm financial plan is that 5.1% growth in expenditures year over year, while our revenues are only growing approximately 3%. I think what will depend on the long-term sustainability is either if inflation continues at this level, which we've embedded into the system, that's not the historical inflation rate. It's closer to 2 to 3%, which is closer to our revenue growth rate. So we've conservatively estimated what the expenditures will grow at, and then we conservatively brought down what we think our revenues will be. So one of those two would have to adjust over time in order to maintain fiscal sustainability over long term. So it's a good observation. We have included those conservative numbers at this point. Only time will tell what happens, but the expectation would be that inflation hopefully will come down at a point in time.
And so then I'm gonna ask another question, and I'm gonna just assume you don't have. I'm gonna assume the answer is either we don't know or the answer is no. And as we're tied to this debt service for the next 27 years, is there a way? Is there any? I mean, is there anything we can do? Or are we just stuck between a rock and a hard place on that?
Mr. Chair.
Mr. McLeod, please.
Thank you. No, so no, we're not. We are stuck from the standpoint that RTD will have to pay that amount back. One of the things that we did when we issued all of our debt is that we were very careful to make sure we left ourselves some room for flexibility in terms of we have budget certainty. So all of our debt is fixed rate. So we don't have any floating interest rates or swaps or any of those types of things that would change what our actual forecasted debt service payment is. So the good news on that front is it's fixed through that period. And there's different levels of funding because each series of bonds has different maturities. It's not level like a home mortgage would be over time. So there is that fluctuation in it. The other thing we did, and you've seen this, as we've come for requests to refinance our debt, is we put in call provisions, 10-year call provisions on virtually all of our issuances, which allows us to refinance that debt at a certain point in time. So that lever gives us the ability, at least on the debt side, some flexibility in terms of restructuring that debt or moving things around to the extent we can, if it came down to that point of having to do that. Obviously, it's frowned upon to extend your debt or do other things. And I think most of our bond covenants do not allow extension of debt, but restructuring it by year possibly could happen. So we've left ourselves some flexibility to move some of those obligations around if necessary. I'd say that would be one of the last resort type of things that we would want to do. But, you're right. We do have to pay the entirety of that amount back.
So this is my last question. Is there an avenue to, and granted, I know that this would hurt in the future, but is there the avenue to pay this down sooner to get out from underneath it? Or are we just looking like, hey, it's 27 years and we're just going to ride this till the end?
We do have certain opportunities to do that. So one recent example actually is we're going through a refinancing right now where we have not met the 10-year call date on certain of our bonds. So what we've asked investors or holders of those bonds to tender them, hey, if you're interested in selling those back to us, we'd like to buy them back because we can generate interest savings for that. And I'm happy to report that we actually closed on the pricing on that today. When we had presented it to the board earlier, and I just found this news out, it was actually better. We actually got more participation in that tender. That I need to share that information with our general manager first, but we did have really good results. But that's an example of where our bondholders, we can go out proactively and ask them to please sell those back to us. So yes, there is that possibility. Or through refinancing too. One of the refinancings we did a year and a half ago, not only did we refinance for lower interest rates, but we used, I believe it was approximately $90 million of cash to actually pay down that debt load that we had, which will save us a lot of interest, RTD, a lot of interest rate over time. So it's a good point that we do have that ability to have some flexibility on that front too.
Great, thank you. I'm done with my questions, but thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Director. We appreciate your participation on that. And you raised some important points, remembering that, among other things, this committee did just over the summer authorize for the board to consider and approve those refinancings that did result in those significant savings. Are there other committee members who have questions at this time for Mr. McLeod or Mr. Nicol or for General Manager CEO Johnson? I see no other committee members with their hands raised. Are there board members who have questions? And Speedy Gonzalez, Director Whitmore, was first. So Director Whitmore, you are recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And it is not a question, it's kind of an observation or a statement. So I'd be happy to go into the line. So I see some probably questions behind me from two very stellar.
You're here now, Director. Go on ahead.
Okay. Well, it just struck me when our general manager was talking about our strategic goals and how they're not divided between fast tracks and base system. Fast tracks was passed almost 20 years ago, and we know that we will have a separation of the two systems financially for the foreseeable future, and also in the court of public opinion about projects that have not been completed. But beyond that, I think we need to merge the thought of the two to one, because more and more of our writers have no idea about fast tracks politics in 2004 or the formation of this very organization in 1969. It's just about moving people. And when you look at the state of good repairs with Fast Track's programs that are beginning to age, some of the older ones are pushing 15 years. I just think it's important that we strategically remember that we're all in this together with one major system, and to be thinking that way as we move forward strategically. Thank you for the time, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Director. We appreciate your input. And now, Director Ruscia, you are recognized, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this question is for Mr. McLeod. Previously, you had said that fares projections are lower than March due to, and I didn't catch the rest. I wasn't sure if you said the fare study analysis or the fares change as we did decrease fares, which I assume ostensibly results in some decrease in revenue. So if you wouldn't mind just clarifying or maybe repeating your statement, I wasn't able to hear you clearly. But my question actually is related to fares revenue and our current trends in ridership and those projections. At what point does staff believe that we will attain pre-pandemic ridership levels? And to that end, I mean, recognizing that we have also decreased fares for the better, does staff have a projection as to when we will also attain pre-pandemic revenues from fares as well?
So, Mr. McLeod, you are recognized to undertake an answer to those questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to answer the first part of the question and then defer to General Manager Johnson for the second part of the question, if okay. So just to repeat what I was referring to, Director Ruscia, and thank you for the question on the fare revenue decrease. So the decrease that's reflected in the midterm financial plan versus last year really takes into account the fare study and equity analysis impacts of the decisions and the approval that the board gave. Prior to that approval, we didn't really have concrete projections about what that would look like because there were a lot of moving pieces, as well as certain calculations that were done by our consultant that hadn't been completed. So now that we have that full picture, those numbers decreased initially in 2024. That drop is really as a result of the implementation of the recommendations from the fare study and equity analysis that the board approved.
Mr. Chair, if I may.
Yes, please, General Manager.
Thank you very kindly. Thank you, Mr. McLeod, for your response, and thank you, Director Ruscia, for your question. As it relates to when might the agency get back to pre-pandemic levels, it's highly unlikely that the agency will not. Recognizing that there has been forecasting and within the transit industry, specifically in North America, there's been discussions that have ensued relative to at least 15% of pre-pandemic ridership being lost permanently. There's a myriad of different factors as it relates to why that may be a reality. It's due to the fact of different shifts that have occurred relative to working environments. There are not individuals utilizing transit services for commuting purposes that were traditionally how transit service delivery was provided, looking at peak hours in the mornings and in the evenings. People are using transit in a myriad of different ways to engage, to go to activity centers, to appointments, and generally off-peak times if one compared that to pre-pandemic levels, say back in January of 2020. As it relates to the fare study and equity analysis and various initiatives that this agency has undertaken, we are utilizing different mechanisms and initiatives to entice people to want to utilize transit services outside of the traditional norm, i.e. when we look at the introduction of zero fare for youth, that investment in trying to ensure that we can garner a transit customer for life, in the sense of starting young and raising one up to understand the socioeconomic benefits as well as environmental impacts. Impacts for the better, that is, as we move forward. Additionally, some critical elements have to be based upon our labor intensive work environment. And that's why we are laser focused right now on those three initiatives I called out: state of good repair. We will not be able to move people if we don't invest in our assets. Director Whitmore made reference to our fast track system and how some elements of it have been in operation for a period of time. We need to invest in that state of good repair. And so that's where our focus is as well. But we also have to focus on people power and the shift in what traditionally enticed people to come to the transit agency. We're looking at different avenues in which to entice people to want to work. Some of those critical issues have to do with the traditional aspect of the shift work and how one goes about selecting their different work shifts as a whole. So embarking upon a myriad of different initiatives to figure out what might land us additional ridership. But the ultimate message I would like to impart is that we need to focus on the value of our transit service model as opposed to the volume, because if we focus on the value through various initiatives, that will reap the volume relative to the ridership, because we want to produce a good product that people will promote. And in doing so, we have to ensure that we can provide timely and efficient services, but we have to have the infrastructure and mechanisms in place. So that is my response, and I'll yield the floor, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you very much, General Manager. And I want to second what you said relative to the transit industry generally, acknowledging that there is this approximately 15% sort of perpetual reduction that is anticipated, as has been verified by the American Public Transportation Association in a number of studies that have been done there. So it's a different world. Director Ruscia, did you have anything further to follow up on relative to your questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I did want to say thank you so much for those responses. I appreciate the candor, detail, and the thought that went into that. It explained quite a bit. I did have another question, if the chair would permit, and I can keep it brief, or I can go ahead and let others answer get theirs in.
Please proceed, Director Ruscia.
Okay, thank you, sir. So this question, do we anticipate any additional capital carry forward expenditures for the next fiscal year, either positive or negative? I assume if so, it would be positive. And I was wondering if staff could address that. I didn't see it in the presentation. And if this is something that is better served for maybe the October meeting, where we'll have a more comprehensive view of our draft budget, that is totally fine. It was just in the back of my mind as listening. And
let me recognize General Manager if there is a quick response to that question.
I thank you very much, Chair Tisdale, and thank you, Director Ruscia, for the question. I'm smiling at CFO McLeod because this has been an undertaking that is very important to all of us, and we are working on it diligently. I will yield the floor to Mr. McLeod to provide some context, but we're not in a place to discuss that now, but it's something that has been a top priority for this organization, for our members of the team. So Mr. McLeod, do you want to summarize really quickly the status?
CFO McLeod.
Thank you. Yes, just briefly, you're correct. That number will appear in the budget that's brought forth in the budget update that's brought forth to this committee in October, as well as the final budget approval request in November. Essentially, as General Manager Johnson mentioned, we've been working to work that down, the capital carry forward being any capital expenditures that are not spent in a single year get carried forward in the budget to the next year. The fiscal policy that approved by the board only allows that to happen for 3 years without any activity, and then that falls back, any unused funds fall back into the general fund. If that 3 years hasn't lapsed, but the project is closed, we'll close it out. Any leftover funding also falls into the general fund, just to give some context. But yes, we've been working on that quite a bit with keeping General Manager Johnson informed on our progress. We have a little bit more work to do and plan to bring that to this committee in coming months.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cloud. We appreciate that. And Director Rusha, I'm taking it that that concludes your questions at this time. And so I'm going to go on and recognize Director Broom.
Thank you, Chair. In previous years, when we talked about the budget, there was never any mention of property taxes or assessed valuations, reassessments, and that type of thing. That's creeped into the discussion tonight, and I guess I'm kind of curious about with the reassessments touching almost 40% this year for a lot of properties. Does that have any impact on our budgeting? And what does that bode for years in the future?
Let me recognize Mr. McLeod on that. A topic near and dear to many of us because RTD does have the power to levy a property tax, which would require, of course, a vote of the electorate. But let me turn to Mr. McLeod for his response.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Two items. So earlier when I mentioned property taxes, it was in the context of how those increases play into the Tabor growth limitations. Essentially, that's part of our limits year over year. That's part of the measurement and how much RTD can retain year over year on the 6/10 for the Tabor revenue growth limitations. Within the district, those valuations, we still have some more work to do internally. We do have a discussion item about the revenue working group that's coming up. One of the items that we'll discuss is approaching those Tabor issues, mainly from the aspect of what can RTD do? How does this impact us? How do those calculations fit into our Tabor revenue growth limitations? The second issue being the revenue portion of that. And so there's some legal issues that we need to look into in terms of revenue from property taxes as well. So sorry not to give a full-fledged answer, but we're still in the discovery stage essentially.
Thank you, but I take it that even though there's going to be changes in what's finally approved in each of the counties as far as assessed value for individual properties, that won't have any impact on the budgets that we're looking at this year.
Mr. McLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Correct. No impact on the budgets that we're looking at this year.
Thank you. That's all I had.
Thank you, Director Broom. Are there any other directors who have questions as to this agenda item at this time? Other than a lingering hand from Director Broom, I don't see any hands up, and therefore we'll conclude that the discussion has now been exhausted. And so I ask at this time, based upon the motion made by Vice Chair Davidson and seconded by Director Guzman, are there any no votes on this item? I see no one indicating a no vote, and therefore this item passes unanimously out of the committee with a recommendation to the full board at its meeting at the end of this month to approve the midterm financial plan. That was our only action item. We now turn to two discussion items that we have on the agenda this evening. The first is on the topic of revenue diversification. And you will recall our discussion at the board retreat relative to this item. And we're going to ask our committee vice chair Davidson and our chief financial officer, Mr. McLeod, to present this item relative to a working group that General Manager CEO has proposed. And we would like to ask for a presentation first, and I'll turn to the vice chair in the first instance and Mr. McLeod as necessary, and then we'll have comments and discussion. Mr. Vice Chair, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll keep it very brief because I'll be handing this right off. I think I'll just start by thanking my colleagues here on the committee and the board for making this a priority. I think we had a good discussion at our retreat this year and discussed this as being a top priority for reasons that we can see already in the midterm financial plan and would be even more apparent in the long-term view. And then likewise, I'd like to very much thank our CEO and General Manager Johnson, as well as our Chief Financial Officer, Doug McLeod, for responding to this, for hearing the urgency in this, and for putting their heads together to convene a working group that staff can then leverage to bring subject matter experts together to come back to this committee and this board and make material recommendations for consideration. So just a long-winded way of saying thank you to both board and staff for helping to prioritize this. With that, I'll hand this off to Chief Financial Officer Doug McLeod, who had written this position paper and prepared this group of subject matter experts. Mr. McLeod, please go ahead.
Mr. McLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Vice Chair Davidson. I do not have a formal presentation. I will just summarize the board documents that are included in the package. So as the chair mentioned, the board retreat that occurred on March 25th of 2023 resulted in a policy recommendation to seek to shore up RTD's financial position. In my previous presentation, I mentioned that RTD is in a good financial position. However, we have some financial risk in terms of our revenue portfolio, if you will. The portfolio essentially is made up of 75% of our revenues, RTD's revenues, coming from sales and use taxes. The concern there is that it subjects this agency to economic volatility. We're dependent on those sales and use taxes from people spending money within the district. So if that changes for the worse, it obviously impacts us to a large extent because 75 to 3/4 of our revenue. We do have some additional sources of revenue, but the intent that came out of that board retreat on March 25th was really to look to address that issue for long-term fiscal sustainability. What can we do about our revenue diversification? Subsequent to that board retreat, there was an update by myself and Director Davidson on May 5th. We proposed a discussion item for this group to consider, which was essentially an unrefined version of what we're presenting tonight. It really was addressing some of the issues that we had identified that we believe should be tackled in terms of addressing this policy direction that the board is seeking to diversify our revenue. Subsequent to that, General Manager Johnson provided a memo on August 22nd to the board, just informing the board that we would be discussing this board item, in particular this working paper draft, at this meeting. So just to summarize what this is all about, essentially we will be putting together, under General Manager Johnson's direction, a working group primarily of staff, and that the composition of that working group is laid out in the revenue diversification working group position paper included in the package. It consists of General Manager Johnson, General Counsel Melanie Snyder, myself, Michael Davies, Government Relations Officer, Brendan Morgan, Senior Manager of Debt and Investments, and Director Davidson as the liaison to the board. The intent of this working group is really to look at and get a very good understanding of the statutes, enabling legislation, and parameters that RTD can work within in terms of addressing its revenue. In addition to that, this working group would include inquiries to third parties such as bond counsel, Tabor experts, and addressing any bond covenants too. So essentially what I'm saying, this working group really needs to do a lot of homework to really understand the landscape within which we're working, not only to address revenue diversification, but some of the limitations that we have, such as Tabor. So in order to do that, we need these subject matter experts that can meet, and we're going to meet on a monthly basis or more frequently if necessary, essentially meet, assign duties to go look and do research and gather information about what we can do to work within these parameters that we have to as an agency, and then develop recommendations to bring to the board at a point in time to address some of these financial challenges we have on the revenue side. Along the way, I should point out that there will be regular updates to this committee and the board regarding our activities and any findings that we have along the way. So that will be important to keep the board informed. And then I believe everything is pretty well laid out in that revenue that revenue position paper. And essentially, we're going to be investigating, evaluating, and reviewing all of our options to bring to the board, because the board is a policymaking body of this organization. By having that information, we can effectively answer questions and address issues that are brought forth by the board. So that concludes my comments, Mr. Chair, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. McLeod. And let me ask General Manager, CEO, if there's anything that you would like to add at this point relative to this revenue diversification working group that we are discussing this evening.
Thank you very much, Chair, for the opportunity to offer up additional comments, and thank you, CFO McLeod. I believe you laid that out very well. Just want to reiterate that this is a working group, and quite naturally with the vice chair of this committee, who basically broached this subject with us some time ago, and additionally with your dialogue at the board retreat, in addition to the comments and discussion that were had at the May Finance and Planning Committee. I want to just stress that this is just staff supporting the board, recognizing that this is a policy decision of the board. And in our role here to do our due diligence, do our main jobs, and quite naturally with our responsibility as fiscal stewards, we want to ensure that we're providing you with ample information. So we will be seeking direction on an ongoing basis, and quite naturally with the vice chair of this committee liaising with us. We could have more frequent updates. This could be a standing agenda item. We look to you for that direction. So I just wanted to stress that's the intent of this working group, and hence that's why we have the working paper for you all's consideration. So thank you very much.
I thank you, General Manager. I think that's very well stated, and I think it should give the committee and ultimately the full board a comfort level with how this is proceeding, so that we have distilled information approaching us instead of just having a broad, unfettered kind of rambling approach. So it's a very focused one that the working group will help put in place for all of us. So now we turn to comments, and we have committee members first, and I will recognize our board chair, Lynn Geisinger. Madam Chair, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Kind of to reiterate some of what is being said, but I've had conversations with Ms. Johnson, Mr. McLeod, and Director Davidson. I apologize I didn't get to you today, Director Tisdale, but Chair Tisdale. But I really appreciate the fact that staff is taking on so much of this fact finding. This was a priority coming out of our board retreat. Director Davidson has done a great job of pushing it forward, and Mr. McLeod, Ms. Johnson, appreciate you heard us and are responding. And I think it's important to say that there is some urgency here and a need for serious board involvement. And the urgency is that there is a lot of discussion now about, you heard the MTFP, and we're about to see the budget, but also in the bigger world, a lot of discussion, both from citizen groups about wanting to help RTD with funding, from legislators, from the governor's office about what we can do to fund transit and move forward on some of the other priorities with TOD and those sorts of things. And, the TLRC that Ms. Johnson and I spoke to a few weeks ago is one of their priority bills is to, they're drafting a bill that would be funding free fares for youth, for zero fares for youth for, I believe, the whole state. And there's also talk of funding for our zero fares. And of course, there's a bigger need. So this is, I think, going to be hugely helpful in terms of the background. If you look at a couple of their first bullet points in their memo, review financial opportunities permitted under RTD's enabling legislation and research revenue compositions of other transit agencies. Though, we got to have this kind of background, and we need to have the kind of expertise that that staff can help bring. At the same time, all hands on deck. And I think I would like to see, and this is why I'm sorry I didn't get to talk to you earlier, Chair Tisdale, but I would like to see us make this a standing discussion item of this committee, where we can look at what's been discussed in the working group meetings and talk about, help direct what needs to be discussed, help respond and move it forward. There's been some discussion that the CAC might also help with looking at the finance issues. I think, there are a lot of different brains that could come to these issues. And so it's not just an update as we might get on many other issues. And I appreciate that Director Davidson is willing to, kind of drive that piece and bring it forward to us. But I think especially again, we have the debrucing question looming. We have been working on some issues around that. I think one of our next steps is to try to get a strategic advisor on that and see where we are. So lots to discuss, lots for the working group to discuss, lots for us to discuss. And thanks for putting it together. Thanks for Director Davidson for keeping it moving forward and being the liaison. Thanks.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I think if only because we will be looking to this group to give us periodic updates, and if they meet at least monthly, I would anticipate that they would be in a position to give us a monthly report, even if it's to say no report. And I think that we can readily make that a part of our standing agenda for the Finance and Planning Committee, because there are few more important topics that we need to address, as was emphasized by some of the comments by the directors during the discussion on the midterm financial plan. So I appreciate your comments and observations on that, Madam Chair. Anything further from you?
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Now let's turn to Director Catlin. Your thoughts, please.
Thank you very much. And I really do appreciate, as Chair Geisinger said, the sense of urgency and import on behalf of staff and Director Davidson. And I think referencing back to General Manager CEO Johnson's comments earlier about the changing transit climate and the way commuting patterns have changed and transit has changed, and we're responding to a very different customer environment than we had previously prior to COVID. I think that kind of factors into this whole analysis as well. And Chair Geisinger also mentioned the fact that there's a lot of talk with legislation in the governor's office about helping RTD, but I want to make sure that they are helped based on based on information and facts. And that's why I very much appreciate the urgency and the regularity with which you're going to report on this. So thank you very much for taking this on. I think it's a real thorough explanation, but I would like to maybe add a couple of nuances with respect to the changing transit environment, as well as some of the, I wouldn't call them risks, but some of the help that we may be seeing in the next legislative session, and how we can be prepared to respond so that we can accept quality help. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We appreciate your thoughts on that, Director Catlin. And yes, the timeliness of this is significant because we are looking at some of our legislators taking their hand at doing some things too, as you said, helping RTD with legislations being drafted. So we'll have to explore that very closely. Vice Chair Davidson, you are recognized, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate it. Great deal here that we're moving this forward. And, thank you, Chair Geisinger, for, adding the emphasis to the urgency here. Just as we've been saying, there are a variety of citizen groups and legislators that have taken an interest in the future of transit in Colorado, which is wonderful. I think that presents a great opportunity for our minds at RTD, who are the most informed on how RTD is working and operating today, to bring forward some ideas for those who might be listening or seeking ideas. I did also want to react to Chair Geisinger, your point about really having all hands on deck and having strong involvement and participation from a board standpoint. So certainly, if it does please, and at the direction of the chair of this committee, Chair Tisdale, and the chair of the board, Chair Geisinger, I am very happy to commit to the liaison role and report every month to this Finance and Planning Committee at the beginning of that discussion item, in much the same way we do our report outs each board meeting on the committee reports. So I'm very happy to maintain notes, maintain the role of liaison, communicate back what's being discussed, what's not being discussed. Thank you, Director Ruscia, for speaking about this and highlighting also what's not being discussed as an item that should come up. So I'm happy to provide those reports, which then can open up when we have a discussion item to facilitate further ideas and discussion. Furthermore, to my colleagues, if you have ideas, if you have things that you're thinking about or you want to check in, please feel free to reach out to me as a liaison. Part of my role will be there to help bridge the gap between not just the committee, but the whole board in this working group. So certainly you have my commitment to maintain urgency. You have my commitment to communicate, and you have my commitment to come and provide those reports at all of our future Finance and Planning committees. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice Chair. And as an ancient leader once said regarding your commitment, so let it be written, so let it be done. We appreciate that. Are there other committee members who have any comments at this time before I open up for general discussion by board members present here this evening? And Director Guzman, you are recognized now, sir.
Thank you. I appreciate that this working group is being formed and the commitments that are being made. I am a little confused about, I am and I'm not. I guess I'm trying to understand it from both sides. We suspended the Tabor Ad Hoc Committee, which was doing some of this work, and we're looking at this maybe in a more holistic way with the expertise and the guidance of the specialists in the agency. There was one particular bit that concerned me, which is that these conversations are not necessarily going to be public. I don't know that they should be, because I don't know what all the subject matter would be. But when it comes to issues where we might need to, as was previously stated, sway public opinion, have a good understanding of the fact that this is the state of the agency, to make sure that we are on the same page with the public, with the legislators, with the community groups, et cetera, et cetera. I just want to put out there for this discussion that we need to make sure that we are as transparent as possible, which I believe is the end goal, right? To keep solvency, to make sure that we're doing the right work in the investigation so that we can have that song sheet so that we can all work together as a board within our respective districts and communities. And so I just want to bring that up. There was one other question that I had for you on this item, which is, and I'm not sure who would answer this, but at the end where it says, a financial impact, there's no foreseeable financial impact, but there may be need to reach out to some specialists. I'm trying to find it in my board document that might incur some cost. And I'm just wondering, is there any reason for concern or a reason for us to think about an apportionment for this work to be done? Mostly because we're talking about planning for the future. And in doing this group, if we have to reach out to somebody for a specialty need, I understand that. I would not be the one you're reaching out to. So somebody with the knowledge would need to be. But how does that compensation then, how would that be approved? Is that going to fall under GM CEO Johnson's purview? with the permissions she's been given by the board to create and sign off on contracts? Is that something that comes back to this group and then to the full board, mostly for efficiency and not to delay any of the research that needs to be done? Thank you.
Thank you, Director. And let me just essay a preliminary answer at least. The delegation of authority resolution by the board to the general manager would be in full force and effect and in no way amended or rescinded by virtue of this working group's operations. So contracts would be handled in the way that is outlined in the delegation of authority. And relative to the initial part of your comments, recall that this is not a body that would in fact take any action. This is a body that would inspect, consider, investigate, and based upon that information, formulate proposals for consideration first by this committee and then secondly by the full board. So I hope that's partially responsive, but let me open up if Madam General Manager, do you have anything further to add to that observation?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You stated what I was going to state, whatever's within my authority, and quite naturally, when we put that forward relative to any costs that this may occur, we would be adhering to our procurement practices and delegation of authority. And for all intents and purposes, if we were seeking somebody to come on board, for all intents and purposes, some hourly rate with a subject matter expert would most definitely not be in the hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars. So thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Madam Chair, we go back to you for a second bite at the apple.
Thank you very much. Those are really good questions, Director Guzman, and sort of the first question sort of underlies some of what I was saying about the importance of keeping the discussion at the board level as well. The working group meetings are essentially staff meetings. You know, they're looking at a lot of details. They will be potentially having subject matter experts. There may be times that we say we want those subject matter experts to come here or to share the meeting or to, you know, we want to hear all of that detail. But I guess I'm comfortable that those meetings are staff meetings. They're working on a lot of the background, but I do agree with you. It's important that we bring that forward. And that's why I say, I think that having a standing discussion in this this venue is important. And I think, yeah, Ms. Johnson sort of answered and Mr. Chair Tisdale answered the second half about costs. You know, there, if we look going forward, I'll just talk for a minute about Tabor. You know, there's we will be looking, we need to be deciding, are we moving forward with the debrucing? There's that question. There's also potentially some questions about what if there's some mitigation steps we could take along the way. That may be more, you know, financial discussion. But in terms of a debrucing question, that is something that we will want everybody here. We all have our own political connections, as you mentioned. And we all have we're going to be having our ears out and hopefully getting some advice to be making those decisions. And those are decisions that I think will be public and all of that. But the working group we can't do that without getting some facts as a background. So that's what I see the working group. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. We appreciate your additional comments on that. Are there any other committee members with comments or questions relative to the Revenue Diversification Working Group matter? Seeing none, let me open up now to the other board members present this evening. Are there other board members who have questions or comments to share with us relative to this discussion item on the Revenue Diversification Working Group? I see no indication of anyone having any further discussion. So therefore, at this time, we'll close our discussion on the Revenue Diversification Working Group. We will turn to our second discussion item on this evening's agenda, and that is the Northwest Rail Peak Service Feasibility Study update. And so I would ask now for Jyotsna Vishwakarma, and I always apologize for messing that up if I do, but Vishwakarma as our acting Assistant General Manager for Capital Programs, and Patrick Stanley, our Manager of Engineering Programs, to present this item, the Northwest Rail Peak Service Feasibility Study update. So if I may, forgive the informality, Jyotsna, if you would take it away, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Board of Directors. I and Patrick Stanley will be giving an update on the Northwest Rail Peak Service Feasibility Study. A brief summary of the update is in the board packet. It starts on page 20. It's 3 pages. And Patrick has a presentation that is on pages 24 through 42 of the board packet. Just as a reminder, the study is to gather a common set of facts to determine the impacts and the requirements to provide the Northwest Rail Corridor with 3 trains from Longmont to Denver Union Station in the morning and 3 trains from the Denver Union Station to Longmont in the evening. So we have been in the study for 18 months with Mr. Stanley leading the charge. Ms. Patrick, would you take it away?
Yes, I will. Can everybody see the screen okay?
Yes.
Yep, good. Okay. Thank you, Jyotsna, Mr. Chair, directors. Again, my name is Patrick Stanley. I serve as the project manager for the Northwest Rail Peak Service Feasibility Study. It's a bit of a mouthful to say all that. But I would like to thank you for the opportunity to present an update on the study and what the team has been working on since our last update, which was on the April 11th Finance and Planning Committee. The following presentation, as Jyotsna mentioned, starts on page 24 of your board packet, if you wanted to follow along in that manner. So in today's project update, we'll provide an overview of the Northwest Rail Peak Service Feasibility Concept, review the current status and project schedule, provide a summary of the community outreach and input efforts, and provide a quick look at the upcoming next steps. So first, and Jyotsna already covered some of this, but I'll go over a little bit again. Realize that there are maybe some people that aren't quite as familiar with what we're trying to do with the peak service study, feasibility study. So I wanted to do a real quick history on kind of where we are, how we got to where we are, what the concept is. And I apologize if this is redundant for some of the folks that have heard this probably several times, but hopefully I will get through this relatively quickly. So the Northwest Rail was included as part of the Fast Tracks vote in 2004. In total, the rail line would include 42 miles of rail service from Denver Union Station to Longmont. A little over 6 miles of the corridor, which is known as the B line, was completed in 2016 as part of the Eagle P3 project. The B line is an overhead electrified segment, and it operates on RTD dedicated and controlled track. And it terminates right now at the Westminster Station near 72nd and Lowell. The remaining 35 miles would actually operate on existing BNSF freight tracks from Westminster to Longmont. So this is obviously a little bit unique to this particular corridor. We don't have any other rail corridors that operate in this manner. So following the passage of the Fast Tracks program, an environmental evaluation was conducted in 2010 that looked at a full service scenario. That included 55 trips per day, 11 new stations, and full double tracking of the entire corridor. But due to a lack of a dedicated funding source at that particular time, the project was not able to be implemented. So in 2013 is kind of a continuation of our effort. We worked on the Northwest Area Mobility Study, or NAMS. And the NAMS project really looked at phasing the full service concept by a segmented approach. But through that study, it was determined by a lot, after careful consideration, RTD, along with the Northwest area stakeholders, really determined that the Northwest Rail was really a longer term goal, with RTD committing to continue to explore the rail corridor and provide periodic updates. So in 2017, the concept of initial peak service was proposed by the Northwest area stakeholders. So this really kind of came up from the communities in the Northwest area and their representatives. From that time until 2021 or so, the RTD staff and stakeholder partners worked to refine what the peak service concept would look like. And also during that time, RTD re-engaged with the BNSF to discuss the feasibility of peak service operation. So the study is assessing the feasibility of an initial peak period service, which consists of 3 weekday morning trips from Longmont to Denver and 3 weekday evening trips from Denver back to Longmont. We're partnering with local jurisdictions to plan 6 new stations along the corridor. And additionally, we're looking at a feasible locations for a maintenance facility in Longmont, since the vehicle technology for the Northwest Rail would differ from our current commuter rail fleet. The study is looking at potential train types and technologies that meet our operational requirements. I'll get into a little bit more about that a little bit later in the presentation. And then throughout the study, we're exploring opportunities for potential partnerships, not only with local jurisdictions and stakeholders, but also with Front Range Passenger Rail. As I mentioned earlier, the project, we're proposing 6 new stations along the extended 35 miles of the segment. So starting from the south, those stations are downtown Westminster, Broomfield 116th, Flatiron, downtown Louisville, Boulder Junction at Depot Square, and downtown Longmont. So right now, real quick, I'd like to provide an update on the milestone progress for the study. As some of you may recall from the April 4th or the April 11th update, the study is broken into a 5 milestone process. Milestone 1, which is a review of the previous planning studies that we've undertaken since the passage of Fast Tracks in 2004 all the way up to 2022. And milestone 2, which is really a discovery effort of local plans and commitments, have both been completed at this point. We're currently at the tail end of milestone 3, which is really to confirm what we're calling the base configuration. So the base configuration identifies those elements needed for RTD to operate peak service concept on the BNSF freight tracks. The team has started to work on milestone 4, which will take a closer look at how the base configuration can support future expansion and how an RTD peak service concept could align with the Front Range Passenger Rail efforts. Finally, in milestone 5, the team will prepare and bring the common set of facts and study documentation to the RTD board at the conclusion of the study. So the image you see here speaks to the project schedule, and we've also included here some major concurrent events. In the April 11th update, it was anticipated that the consultant work, which is the top portion right here with HDR, would conclude at the end of 2023. RTD has contracted with the BNSF Railroad to complete a 30% design and provide cost estimates for railroad improvements needed for peak service. And that duration really, when we got the agreement done with BNSF, it actually extends out until the middle of 2024. So that's kind of the middle section here that's shaded is the BNSF schedule. So as the railroad infrastructure requirements and cost estimates provide key data for our project, the study schedule has been revised to coincide with the BNSF schedule. Also shown on the slide, though, I wanted to point out that the Front Range Passenger Rail Service Development Plan is also underway, and the extension of the schedule will allow more insight into how Northwest Rail peak service concept and Front Range Passenger Rail could be mutually beneficial. As you can see from the study milestone schedule, milestone 3, which is really to determine the base configuration right here, is getting close to completion, with at least the bulk of it. But since the BNSF effort, as well as other design refinements, are still progressing, there really is going to be a need to revisit that base configuration from time to time and kind of plug those numbers and that information back into our assumptions of what the base configuration is. This is really symbolized on this schedule by the dashed line that really continues all the way to the end of the study timeframe. The shaded area on the left is approximately where we currently are now, and you can see we're planning really in the fall here our next major upcoming open houses. So I want to spend a few minutes discussing some of the base configuration elements that we've been working on over the last several months. The study team is working with the BNSF, as we mentioned, to determine possible locations of passing sightings, consisting of a second track that parallels the mainline track. The BNSF had previously identified 4 locations along the corridor for passing sightings that allow RTD to have priority operations during peak periods. So the concept is the freight trains would actually pull over onto these passing sightings and would allow RTD to run during those peak period windows without interference of the freight traffic. So this is I want to point out, this is a little bit illustrative. It's really just to kind of get the point across as to how this really works. Obviously, these freight trains are much longer than this, and just so everybody knows, these freight sidings are really approximately about 9,000 feet long. So they're pretty significant in length. The team is also coordinating closely with the Northwest jurisdictions to refine station designs. These efforts include platform locations, station park and ride configurations, and connections to existing infrastructure. The team is also looking closely at several operational options and scenarios. It is not the intent of the study to identify a specific vehicle technology for the proposed service. With that being said, I would like to make it clear that an overhead electrical powered system is not feasible for this section of the corridor due to clearance restrictions along the freight tracks. But diesel, hybrid, battery, and hydrogen vehicles could all be potentially viable options to meet operational needs, depending on technology development and implementation timeframe for the Northwest Rail, if it were to move forward to the next. Sorry, the lights went out on me. The next stage. The team is analyzing a maintenance facility at the end of line in Longmont. That's what this image is right here. Originally, we had 9 sites identified for a possible maintenance facility location. Through 2 different levels of screening, 3 potential site locations remain in the study. It is important to understand, and I want to make very clear, make sure everybody understands this completely. It's important to understand that we don't have any current plans or authorizations to actually acquire any property for a maintenance facility. But what we do want to know is what are the environmental and equity impacts that would go into a maintenance facility. So having these 3 sites allows us to gather some of that information, and we can come up with an accurate or a reasonable cost assumptions for what it would take to mitigate any of those concepts. The team has also worked with an outside consultant to understand the impacts associated with different midday layover locations. So obviously, we've got a large gap between the AM peak trains that come in the morning and the evening trips back. So we have to have a place to put those trains during the day. So where that happens has a variety of different impacts. We have concessionaires that we need to think about. Basically traffic as you come into DUS is very congested. So kind of the way those operate, we're taking a look at different scenarios there for how that might work and what is the most efficient way to do that. So environmental justice, it's important to understand the impacts of the project to the environmental justice communities to avoid disproportionate burdens. So the study team continues to work through the environmental justice technical analysis, and we have a series of strategic pop-up events are being planned with the goal of identifying equity-focused or cultural events, to get that word out a little bit broader. A schedule is being developed for impacts and benefits workshops in late September and October timeframes. These workshops will include jurisdictional representatives, design professionals, and key community-based organizations to help better understand any potential impacts and benefits to the community as a result of a potential peak service operation. Finally, the team is working with the RTD Civil Rights Division and our consultant to conduct a preliminary Title VI service change equity analysis. And I would like to just note that we can't do a final Title VI equity analysis until there's actually a real service change occurring. But again, this is one of those things we want to do the preliminary analysis so that we understand any impacts that might require mitigation or design considerations and how those might factor into the cost of the project. So you've heard us say multiple times throughout the study at this point, the common set of facts. And the common set of facts for this study are intended to provide a single source of consistent information regarding the facts of the peak service concept. So these facts consist of the infrastructure requirements, what needs to be constructed in order for peak service from the existing Westminster Station to Longmont to actually operate. What are the costs? What will it cost to construct all the necessary infrastructure that's identified? And how much will it cost to operate? What is the ongoing cost commitment that we would have to have? Impacts and benefits. How does a peak service operation impact or benefit the surrounding community? What needs to be considered in the design and captured in the cost estimates? And then ridership. What is the expected usage of the service? So RTD has received community feedback through the open houses that occurred at the beginning of 2023, pop-up events, online meetings, surveys, and through the project website. So to date, the study has generated over 400 comments or email signups, approximately 3,300 total views of self-guided online meetings, 188 completed surveys, and over 7,000 visits to the project website. The team is currently conducting informal pop-ups at community events throughout the Northwest community. We just probably about a month and a half ago or so, or a month or so ago, did the Broomfield Brouhaha. We also did the Boulder Bike to Work Day. We did 2 locations. We did the morning and evening location for those. We just recently, this last weekend, attended the Climate Action Sunday. The Ways We Travel in Longmont, had a booth up there and provided information. And we are currently scheduling and working with the stakeholders for Rhythm at the Roosevelt, Longmont, Westy Fest in Westminster, Saturday's Farmers Market in Louisville, and Halloween Spectacular in Louisville. In addition to this, we're also going to have those targeted, we're still working on scheduling some of those targeted equity and culturally, not sensitive, but centered pop-up events. So as we stated earlier, we're going to continue to work through the identification of infrastructure requirements, such as the track configuration and station needs. This information, as well as the BNSF efforts, are key to understanding the common set of facts that will continue to be developed, as I mentioned here earlier in milestone 3, the base configuration facts. We will continue to engage the community through public outreach. This summer and fall, the team has scheduled and will continue to schedule and provide information at community pop-up events. With the next round of public open houses slated for fall/winter of this year. It's going to, a lot of that information is going to depend somewhat on what we get from the BNSF and what we can actually present as far as the passing sightings as we work through some of those details. And I would like to thank all the board participation and support in project efforts and for your interest in the project. I know I've seen several of the board members at some of these events, and I appreciate your support. We're pleased to be able to present this information to you all this evening, and I would look forward to hearing any questions anybody has.
Thank you very much, Dr. Stanley. So we now turn to the committee members in the first instance for any questions or comments that you may have relative to the Northwest Rail peak service update that we have just received. So committee members, questions, comments, please feel free. Vice Chair Davidson, you are recognized, sir.
Thank you, Chair. I'll keep it very brief and just say thank you for all that community outreach and for making the effort to go out to the events. As you mentioned, common set of facts is the key, and that frequent communication with not just all the stakeholders that we frequently talk about, but also the community directly is very much appreciated. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Chair. Board Chair Geisinger, you are recognized.
Thanks. I'll keep it brief as well. The workshops were very well received and I thought they went very well. What is the, what did you call it? An impacts and benefits workshop? Is that something different, Patrick?
Mr. Chair, if I may.
Yes, please. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Yeah, it's actually an interesting concept our consultant came up with. So there's actually kind of two of them really. One of them first is more of an internal piece with our experts from the consultant team. So we'll get together and you think about all the feedback that we've gotten so far, all the analysis that we've done to date, and really kind of get an idea of, okay, what do we, where do we think some of this is kind of going, and really just to put together how we want to and what we want to talk about with the stakeholders. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that conversation can't go wherever it needs to go, but the second one is I think the critical one. And that's where we want to bring in members of the community, these community-based organizations, our jurisdictional stakeholder representatives, our consultant team and us, and really kind of by a committee, kind of as a group, talk about, what type of impacts and benefits that we see for the corridor that we might need to take into consideration. So maybe rather have more of a conversation about it with some of the key figures here, rather than kind of we send something out and then we publish something, we get feedback back and forth. It's really more of a kind of a work through the issues and think about what the issues are. We don't necessarily always going to necessarily understand everything that might be of concern to somebody. So I think this gives them a forum to hopefully, more bring this up in more of a conversational setting, so that we can really kind of dive down deep into it. So I've never been through one of these before. It'll be interesting. I can't speak necessarily personally about how they go. But I am kind of excited about the concept. I think it was interesting, and I'm glad our consultant team brought this forward as a potential way to help out with our environmental justice and equity efforts.
Madam Board Chair, anything further from you? Thank you very much. Any other committee members who have comments? Director Guzman, you are recognized.
Thank you. I am trying to follow along and understand on the BNSF concept design. I'll be honest, like we're doing this design with them, but that doesn't mean we've committed to anything. Just for clarification, like we haven't committed to building additional tracks along the BNSF railroad at this point, right? This is just conceptual.
And it looks like General Manager CEO Johnson would like to weigh in on that first.
Yes, Mr. Chair, thank you. And Director Guzman, thank you for the inquiry. Recognizing we're trying to get a common set of facts, we do not own the right of way. So we have to partner with the BNSF to see what might be feasible. We entered into an agreement just recently in July. I'd like to commend staff. They forfeited their recognized holiday, which happened to be Juneteenth on June 19th of 2023, because that was the only date that the BNSF could take this meeting. And in doing so, we were able to sit down, have discussions relative to what might be, because we will have no understanding of operability, sans a discussion with them. So recognizing that we have engaged or entered into an agreement is specifically to determine what might service be relevant to it being feasible. So there's no obligation and we have not done anything. And plus, the parameters of our engagement does not entitle us to do that, nor would I have the authority to do so without coming to the board. And this is purely a feasibility study, and this will help us align with other type of opportunities that may present itself, i.e. The Front Range Passenger Rail District as well. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Guzman. Yes, I think it's important to note that this is all about not building a railroad, but using a railroad. And that's why we need the discussions with the BNSF. Director Catlin, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm to understand that we are paying BNSF to complete 30% design of these sidings. And is that correct?
Mr. Chair.
Yes, please proceed.
That is correct. We do have a contract with them to provide engineering services and cost estimating services and modeling. So they have to look at really the alignment. We give them what our schedule is to run trains on the alignment, and they have to take a look at their operations and see what the impact of that is to their current operations. So we do have a contract with them to do that. They have engaged a consulting firm to help them go through that effort for the 30% design. It has been quite some time since we engaged the BNSF kind of in this manner. I think early on, maybe 2013, I think they did some plans for us for the full service concepts and double tracking. So updated information is pretty urgently needed. I think it's part of this study to really understand what the current situation is, what the current costs and impacts would be to the BNSF.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, if I might have a follow-up.
Yes, you may.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. I went down with a delegation just prior to COVID in 2020 to the BNSF to talk about these concepts and some of their operational requirements. But I kind of understand some of the parameters with which they're operating, including grades and separations and that kind of thing. But I just wanted to point out to you that I think we have, as an agency, overcapitalized at the expense of operations. And I'm really pleased to learn that part of your analysis is looking at the cost of operations for this potential improvement. And so I just wanted to thank you for that, because I think that's a key component of this whole analysis. So I just wanted to make that comment. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Director Catlin. And again, one of the reasons that we've been informed relative to the extension of time needed to accomplish the feasibility study is the BNSF timeline, as you saw earlier in the presentation. Any other committee members who have comments at this time relative to this discussion item? If not, are there board members who would like to weigh in with any comments or questions at this time relative to the Northwest Rail Peak Service Plan feasibility study update? Seeing no indication of any, I'm sorry, Director Ruscia, there you are. You just came in under the wire.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Narrowly escaped the hand raising. I apologize. I actually just had a clarifying question regarding Title VI. So perhaps General Manager Ms. Johnson can address that. So I understand that environmental justice Title VI analysis is separate from a general service change analysis. And I was wondering if you might be able to briefly touch on what that would entail for a project like this or for a study like this. And I asked because my understanding is that before Fast Track went to the voters and RTD moved forward with those projects, we did an original Title VI analysis. And so if you could maybe clarify or expound upon what the requirements are of the agency when we do these projects in a phased build out. Do we need to do a Title VI analysis at each stage of a build out? And how might that impact what we have before us in terms of just getting a common set of facts?
Thank you. And Madam General Manager, if you can, as the director indicated, briefly address that.
Thank you, Chair Tisdale, and thank you, Director Ruscia, for your inquiry. So I heard a couple of questions in there. First, you wanted to know the difference relative to our service changes. And quite naturally, when we do a service change, we have a threshold relative to a route or a line being modified by 25%. If there is an impact to service by 25%, that warrants what we would do a service equity analysis under the guise of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. When we talk about environmental justice, what you heard from Mr. Stanley relative to where we are currently, we have no understanding what the operating plan would be. So we can't do anything at this juncture, but if you have a specific build out and there's a period of time in which has spanned, it's incumbent upon us to go back and do an additional equity analysis due to the fact there could be change in demographics. We're looking at disparate impacts and disproportionate burdens to low income and minority populations, and recognizing that there could be shifts in those categories just by virtue of development, economic land use, and a myriad of different factors. It's incumbent upon us. And so specifically, we as an agency, recognizing the importance of providing equitable transit services, will be undertaking what would be most prudent as we look to see what impacts our service delivery model or any type of construction may have on the region in which we're serving, because we have to look at the 2,342 square mile route area and other aspects as it relates to constructing any type of facility. What impacts could that have on that specific area? So if we're looking at a maintenance facility in and around Longmont, and that was RTD's facility, what type of disproportionate burden or disparate impact could it have on that population in that immediate area? So there's two differing factors that come into play relative to service delivery as it relates to environmental justice.
Thank you very much, Madam General Manager. Anything further that you would like to probe based upon that, Director Risha?
Mr. Chair, thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much. Are there any other board members with comments or questions relative to this discussion item? He paused. Director Guzman, you're back, sir. Yes.
Sorry, just a real quick one. On slide number 12, the base configuration, you did discuss that there were 9 original sites. You're down to 3 now. You're looking at those. They're potential sites, I get that, but perhaps one of the directors from Longmont might be able to inform the answer on this one. How are the folks in Longmont looking at this? Like, are they down with the idea of having it there? Because we do have to park those trains somewhere. So I understand the need for it. I just don't know what the city's saying. So anybody know? Just a curiosity. Thank you.
Let's go to General Manager CEO Johnson for a response to that.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Director Guzman, for the question. When we embarked upon this critical initiative, because we wanted to ensure we had a common set of facts, we did it intentionally. So when a scope of work was developed, we basically leveraged our partners along the alignment corridor. They are currently still involved. So when we talk about the city of Longmont, Mr. Stanley's nodding his head and he could speak to this more, but we have staff from that municipality and others that are working in tandem. So when we're talking about what might options be, those are being generated from our jurisdictional partners. So Mr. Stanley, you want to expound just really quickly?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Yeah, we, Longmont is part of our SAT, our study advisory team. Phil Greenwald from the city is on there. And, we have pretty good regular communications with them. We have sat down specifically with them about these potential maintenance facilities and kind of worked with what they see as their city planning and how it's going as well. So they have, without getting into too many details, they've got, looking at redeveloping the sugar beet factory and the steam area, whatnot. So we've kind of talked, and in fact, part of the screening criteria has actually been city zoning and city usage of the area. So we did take that into consideration. So right now, we've got a fairly favorable view from the city on these locations. Kind of tried to stay away from some of them that they had kind of identified for, multi unit housing, some denser housing and some things like that as far as the steam goes. But So yeah, I think the relationship is good, and I think they're optimistic about certainly the locations here.
Thank you so much. I'm not trying to step out of my district too far, but we all work together. So it was just a really like, I love Longmont. My sister's the postmaster up in Louisville. So, you know, I'm pretty familiar with the geography. I'm just looking at the map going, what did the city say? So that's really all it was. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Director Guzman. We are all one big happy district. So we absolutely do watch out for everyone. Are there other board members who have comments or questions relative to this discussion item at this time? I see no other hands raised. All right, that will conclude then our discussion relative to the Northwest Rail Peak Service Plan Feasibility Study update. We now turn to other matters. Are there any other matters that the committee members wish to bring forward for discussion at this time? Hearing none, let me just say that I would like you to please note that the chair does have another matter to bring up. There was supposed to be another item on tonight's agenda. Through oversight, inadvertence, and excusable neglect, that item was not included in your agenda this evening. This item is a time-sensitive one that needs immediate action. It concerns a pass-through carbon reduction grant for the city and county of Denver's Colfax Avenue Bus Rapid Transit Project in the amount of $5 million. This item is for RTD to serve as a conduit, a funding agent, a pass-through mechanism for federal grant funds. This is not RTD money. It is federal money that would simply pass through RTD as a funding agent. As a result of this administrative error, the item is not presented tonight, but it will be presented for your consideration through the following procedure. Specifically, the executive committee at its meeting this week will review and discuss and hopefully will put on the agenda for the full board at its meeting at the end of this month. That is the $5 million pass through. And let me now recognize Board Manager Kroll to supplement and possibly even correct anything I've just said.
The only correction I have is that the executive committee will meet next week. And as a result of this coming through the executive committee, it will not be eligible to be placed on the consent agenda. So although Director Tisdale did a great job of explaining the relative formality of this procedural vote, it is going to have to come as a separate action item to the full board. And with that, I just want to also take responsibility that this didn't make it on the agenda tonight. That's my fault. We should have had it included in the board packet, and we didn't get that done, and so I apologize for that.
Thank you very much for that acknowledgement, Mr. Kroll. The item is corrected. It will be at the executive committee meeting next month, and it will not go on the consent agenda. It would come on as a recommended action. Director Broom, if you don't mind, let me go to General Manager Johnson first before going to you. General Manager.
Yes, thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to provide clarification. You stated that it would go to the executive committee next month. It is going to the executive committee on Thursday, September 21st.
I may have misspoken. I thought I said next week, but whatever. I mean, in any event, at the next executive committee meeting, which will be held prior to the September full board meeting. Director Broom, you are recognized, sir.
Thank you, Chair. Are industrial revenue bonds involved with this?
And so who would want to respond to that first? Is that General Manager Johnson? You are recognized.
Yes, thank you very kindly. This is federal funding that was basically awarded to the Colfax BRT, recognizing that RTD is the federal designated recipient for federal dollars. So this is through a competitive financial grant program. So the answer would be no, as it relates to what we're doing, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Director Broom. All right, any other matters based upon this discussion now that we've just had? I hear none. So now, relative to our next meeting date, please note that the next Finance and Planning Committee meeting is scheduled for Tuesday, October 3. Same bat time, same bat channel. This is a slight deviation relative to that scheduling from our standard meeting cadence, so that directors and staff will be able to attend the APTA Transform and Expo conference the week of October 9th. So please note the next meeting is Tuesday, October 3. And seeing no other discussion from any of the committee members, let me note for the sake of the record that this meeting is now adjourned as of 7:41 p.m. Mountain Daylight Time on Tuesday, September 12, 2023. Thank you all very much for your participation. We look forward to seeing you at our next meeting. Good evening.